Memorial Day, 1994. The brickyard is packed to the rafters, and two black and red cars are pulling away from the field as though everyone else has been bolted to the tarmac. The rival teams keep staring at their timing screens in disbelief. The engine behind that speed had never won a race, and it would never turn another competitive lap after today. Yet within a fortnight, the sport would move to ban it. This is the story of how a small workshop in Northamptonshire humiliated the American establishment and got itself outlawed for being too good. To understand it, you have to go back about 10 years and roughly 4,000 miles east to a market town called Brixworth. Two men had walked out of Cosworth, the famous English engine house, to start something of their own. One was Mario Illion, a Swiss designer with an almost obsessive eye for detail. The other was Paul Morgan, a British engineer who ran the manufacturing and the money side. They put their surnames together, Illion and Morgan, and called the company Ilmor. It was not a giant. It was a handful of people in an industrial unit in rural Northamptonshire, betting everything on the idea that they could build a better racing engine than anyone else on Earth. Leaving Cosworth in the mid-1980s was not a small thing to do. Cosworth was the most respected name in racing engines on the planet, and its DFX turbo unit had a stranglehold on American open-wheel racing, so complete that it had won the Indianapolis 500 year after year after year. Walking out of a place like that to set up on your own in a rented unit with no customers and no engine was the sort of decision that looks visionary in hindsight and reckless at the time. Illion had a reputation for chasing tiny gains that lesser engineers would not have noticed, let alone bothered to pursue. Morgan had the rare gift of turning those drawings into hardware that actually held together under the brutal loads of a race engine. One of them could see the last 0.5%, the other could make it survive 500 miles. Between them, they were quietly building one of the finest engine shops in the world, a long way from the glamour of the sport it served. They needed a backer, and they found the perfect one. Roger Penske, the most successful team owner in American open-wheel racing, agreed to fund them, and he brought General Motors along with him. The engine that came out of that arrangement was badged as a Chevrolet, and it was drawn and machined in England. It took a couple of seasons to find its feet, and then it did something nobody had managed in a decade. It broke Cosworth. Through the late 1980s and into the 90s, that little firm from Brixworth won championship after championship and Indianapolis after Indianapolis, and the old order simply had no answer for it. By 1994, Mercedes-Benz had bought into the operation, and the small English workshop suddenly had one of the biggest names in motoring stamped on its cam covers. So Ilmor were not underdogs in the sense of being weak. By this point, they were the establishment engine, the thing everybody else was trying to beat. But the story that made them legends did not come from building a better version of what everyone already had. It came from reading the rulebook more carefully than anyone else in the paddock. What everybody in American racing had overlooked was buried in plain sight. The regulations for Indy car engines were built around compact, modern, overhead camshaft turbo units. Those were capped at roughly 2.65 litres, about 160 cubic inches, and they were held to 45 inches of turbocharger boost. That was the box the entire front of the grid was fighting inside. Tucked away in the same rulebook, though, was a concession written for a different kind of engine entirely. Old-fashioned pushrod motors, the sort derived from humble production blocks, were allowed far more generous terms. They could be much bigger, up to 209 cubic inches, and they were permitted to run 55 inches of boost instead of 45. More engine and more pressure, handed over in writing to anyone who wanted it. Why would the rule makers give away such an advantage? Because they assumed nobody serious would ever take it. The pushrod allowance was charity. It existed to let privateers and small teams bolt in a cheap agricultural American stock block engine and at least make the field, puttering around at the back while the proper machinery fought for the win. It was a rule written for underdogs and no-hopers. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing so much better. The clause had already been used. Buick had been turning up at Indianapolis for years with a stock block V6 running the pushrod allowance, and every so often that engine did something startling. It put a car on pole in 1985. It did it again in 1992 with a lap that had the whole speedway sitting up. On raw, straight-line speed, the pushrod cars could be frightening. The trouble was that they almost never made it to the end. They would qualify brilliantly and then wilt or let go entirely, and by half distance the story was over. So the sport had a category of engine that was demonstrably fast and reliably fragile, and it drew exactly the wrong lesson from it. Instead of asking what a pushrod engine might do if somebody built it properly, everybody concluded that pushrod engines were a stunt. Fine for a headline on qualifying day, never a threat on race day. The establishment looked at that clause, if they looked at it at all, and they laughed. A pushrod engine at the sharp end of the Indianapolis 500? The idea was almost quaint. It belonged to a bygone era. Roger Penske did not laugh. Penske read that same clause and saw a loophole big enough to drive a car through. The rule said pushrod. It did not say cheap. It did not say adapted from a road car. Nobody had written down that the engine had to be a lump lifted out of a saloon because nobody had imagined a world in which somebody would spend serious money finding out. So Penske went to his English engine builders with a quietly outrageous question. What if they did not adapt a stock block at all? What if they designed a brand new, purpose-built pushrod racing engine from a blank sheet of paper and fed it all that extra size and all that extra boost the rulebook was practically giving away? At Brixworth, Mario Ilian and his team set to work in complete secrecy. They called the project the 500i, and what they created had nothing agricultural about it. It was a bespoke V8, engineered to the same fanatical standard as everything else Ilmor built, only now it was breathing in an enormous amount of turbo pressure that the regular engines were forbidden. The timescale is the part that still makes engineers wince. This was not a multi-year program with a comfortable development window. It was a clean-sheet racing engine, conceived, drawn, cast, machined, assembled and made to survive 500 flat-out miles in a matter of months. The secrecy held, and that is remarkable in itself. Motor racing paddocks leak, suppliers talk, mechanics move between teams, and photographers point long lenses at anything with a cover over it. Yet, Ilmor ran their conventional engines in public through the early season, while back in England, the real weapon was taking shape on the dynamometer. Testing was done quietly and well away from the eyes of rival teams. Some of the people who would eventually be beaten by this engine did not properly understand what they were looking at until it was in the car and running at the speedway. There is a lovely audacity to what Ilmor had done. The rest of the paddock had treated the pushrod clause as a relic, a bit of the rulebook nobody bothered to read twice. Ilian treated it as an open invitation. Every fraction of extra displacement and every extra inch of boost the regulations offered up to a stock block engine, his bespoke design would exploit to the very last decimal place. It was not cheating, and that was the part rivals found so hard to swallow. Everything about the 500 I sat squarely inside the letter of the law. The little English firm had simply understood that law better than the people who wrote it. The standard field at Indianapolis that year was making somewhere in the region of 800 horsepower. When the covers finally came off Penske's secret engine at the Speedway, the 500i was reportedly producing close to 1,000. Sit with that for a moment. This was not a clever tenth of a second here or there. It was 150, maybe 200 more horsepower than everybody else, wrung out of a design the entire sport had written off as a joke for backmarkers. The men who had smiled at the pushrod clause now had to watch it hammered into the record books at their own showpiece event. Qualifying gave the game away. Al Unser Jr. put his Penske on pole at over 228 miles per hour, and the cars were monstrous down the straights, carrying speed the rest of the grid simply could not answer. Watch the footage, and the advantage is almost comic. The Penskes are not edging clear, they are leaving. And yet, even then, some rivals told themselves the pushrod engine would never last. All that boost, all that stress, and the whole history of the pushrod allowance said the same thing. These engines break. Wait it out, and the race will come back to us. It was the sort of comforting story you tell yourself when you have already been beaten and you are not quite ready to admit it. It was also, in fairness, based on 20 years of evidence. The problem was that the evidence described Buick stock blocks. And this was not a Buick stock block. This was a purpose-built Ilmor. On race day, the comforting story fell apart within the first hour. What unfolded on that Sunday was not really a contest, it was a demonstration. Emerson Fittipaldi and Al Unser Jr., both in their Brixworth-powered Penske's, drove away from a field of the finest cars and drivers in the world as if they were competing in a different category altogether. They did not just lead, they lapped people. They carved through traffic that represented the very best America and the wider racing world could put on that grid, and they left it behind. Between them, the two Penske cars would lead all but a handful of the 200 laps. This was total, systematic domination by an engine that had never so much as won a race before that month. You could see it in the body language on the pit walls. Crews who had arrived at Indianapolis believing they had a real shot at the biggest prize in the sport spent the afternoon watching two cars they could not touch. Every restart told the same story. The green flag would drop and the Penskes would simply motor away, the extra power turning what should have been a fight into a procession. The commentary that day keeps reaching for ways to describe a race that has stopped being a race. Spare a thought for the other engine builders that afternoon. Ford and Cosworth and Honda had all poured enormous budgets into their Indy car programs, chasing hundredths of a second through the only door the regulations appeared to leave open. Their engineers had done nothing wrong. They had optimized beautifully inside the box everybody agreed to compete in. The trouble was that a firm in Northamptonshire had noticed the box had a second door, marked clearly unlocked and ignored for a decade. There is no amount of clever detail work that saves you from that. When one competitor is allowed a third more engine and a quarter more boost than you are, the contest is decided before anybody starts an engine, and every hour those rival teams had spent in the wind tunnel and on the dyno counted for very little. And then came the moment that told you everything about how lopsided it had become. Emerson Fittipaldi built such an obscene advantage that he found himself catching his own teammate, the second Penske, in order to put Unser Jr. a lap down and stamp his authority on the whole thing. Think about what that means. The Penske engine was so far ahead of the entire field that the only car worth racing was the other Penske. The rest of the Indianapolis 500 had effectively been reduced to scenery. Was there a more complete humiliation of a sports establishment anywhere in motor racing that decade? It is hard to think of one. There was still a sting in the tail. Chasing that extra lap with about 15 to go, Fittipaldi pushed a fraction too hard, brushed the wall and crashed out of a race he had utterly controlled. The lead fell to Al Unser Jr., who brought the surviving Penske home to win the 78th Indianapolis 500, with Jacques Villeneuve second and Bobby Rahal third. Two very different fates for the two English-powered cars, but the point had been made in letters 10 feet tall. The little firm from Northamptonshire had walked into the cathedral of American motorsport and rewritten the service. So how did the establishment respond to being so thoroughly embarrassed? It did what establishments so often do when an outsider beats them at their own game. It changed the rules. Barely 2 weeks after the checkered flag, the sanctioning body announced that for the following season, the purpose-built pushrod engines would have their boost cut. By late summer, the allowance had been trimmed again, and before long the loophole was closed altogether, with the bespoke pushrod engine effectively outlawed for 1996. The 500i, the engine that had just delivered one of the most crushing performances in the history of the race, was legislated out of existence. It won the only major race it ever entered, and then it was banned, a perfect record, retired by decree. Undefeated, unbeaten, and unwelcome. There is something almost poetic about an engine whose entire competitive career was a single, flawless, forbidden afternoon. Only a small number were ever built, a few surviving collections and museum cabinets, and if you ever get to stand in front of one, it is worth remembering that you are looking at a machine with a 100% win record and a lifetime ban. Consider what that cost. Penske funded a clean sheet racing engine with all the casting, machining, dyno work and testing that implies for one afternoon of racing. Millions of dollars, months of a world-class engineering team's time for a single event. Most owners would consider that madness. Penske looked at the rulebook, worked out that the return on that spending was the biggest race on earth, and wrote the check. That willingness to spend properly on an idea everybody else had dismissed is as much a part of this story as the engineering. You can read the ban two ways. The official line was fairness, closing an anomaly before it distorted the sport. And there is something in that. A rule written to help the poorest teams had been turned into a weapon by the richest one, which is not what the people who drafted it had in mind. But there is a less flattering reading, and it is the one the results support. A small, independent workshop, staffed by a Swiss designer and a British engineer and a few dozen brilliant people, had outthought and out-engineered the might of American motorsport so completely that the only way to stop them was to make what they had built illegal. You do not ban something because it failed. You ban it because it worked far too well and because you cannot beat it any other way. That is not a mark of shame on Brixworth. That is the highest compliment the establishment could possibly have paid them. And here is the part that turns a good story into a genuinely remarkable one. That anonymous industrial unit in Northamptonshire did not fade away after 1994. Mercedes-Benz deepened its involvement, and over the following years the Brixworth operation grew into the beating heart of the German company's racing engine program. The very same site, the very same lineage of engineers, would go on to build the power units that dominated Formula One through the hybrid era, winning title after title and powering Lewis Hamilton to the summit of the sport. The workshop that America felt compelled to ban in 1994 quietly became one of the most successful engine operations the world has ever seen. Paul Morgan did not live to see most of it. He was killed in 2001 flying a vintage aircraft, and the racing world lost one of the finest engine men it has ever had. Mario Ilian carried on, and the company the two of them started in a rented unit is now woven into the history of both American and European motorsport. The talent was never a fluke. The 500i was simply the first time everybody had to admit it. That is what I find so satisfying about this one. It is a reminder that world-class engineering does not always come from the biggest names or the deepest pockets. Sometimes it comes from a handful of people in a shed in the English countryside who read the rulebook, spotted what everyone else had dismissed, and built something so good it had to be outlawed. They laughed at the small English firm. Then it won by a mile. Then they banned it. And every one of those three acts, the mockery, the triumph, and the ban, is really just proof of the same thing. So I will put the question to you, when a governing body reaches for the rulebook the moment an outsider wins, is that fair sport protecting itself, or is it the establishment admitting it has been beaten and simply refusing to lose gracefully? I genuinely want to know where you land on that, because I think it says a lot about how we treat brilliance when it comes from the wrong postcode. Tell me in the comments. I go through the comments on every video and I read the arguments on both sides. If stories of British and Commonwealth engineering embarrassing far bigger rivals are your sort of thing, consider subscribing, because there are plenty more where this came from.